You know, history rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony or a clear declaration. The most profound transformations in global power tend to emerge quietly, camouflaged as chaos, dismissed as noise, and often buried beneath headlines that seem far more urgent at the time. And right now, as much of the world remains distracted by tariff headlines and the theatrics of trade war rhetoric, something far more consequential is unfolding beneath the surface. Something that future scholars of international relations will spend decades unpacking. Because what we are witnessing is not merely a policy shift. It is not about tariffs, deficits, or negotiation tactics. It is something deeper, structural, systemic, and irreversible. The United States, under Donald Trump, is in the process, perhaps unintentionally, of transferring a historic strategic advantage to China. Not through defeat, not through collapse, but through miscalculation. And the most fascinating part?
This transfer is happening without full awareness from the very architect of these decisions. I am Professor Jian, and tonight we are not here to skim the surface. We are not here for headlines or simplified narratives. We are here to dissect, to go into the structural core of what is actually taking place. Because this is not a story about trade policy. This is a story about the reconfiguration of the global order. At its heart lies a single, powerful variable: trust. Who maintains it, who erodes it, and who, quietly and methodically, accumulates it while others are busy dismantling their own. Let us begin with a moment that at first glance seems straightforward, but was anything but. When the United States launched its trade war against China in 2018, the immediate reaction in Beijing was not confidence. It was concern, genuine concern. Within the leadership circles, there were serious discussions about economic vulnerability, about the fragility of an export-driven model facing pressure from its largest consumer market. There were fears of supply chain disruption, slowing growth, and strategic exposure. And those concerns were justified. Because the real threat was never tariffs alone. The true risk for China was something far more dangerous: coordinated pressure. A unified front, bringing together Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, aligned not just economically, but strategically. A coalition built on patience, discipline, and shared long-term objectives. That is the kind of pressure that reshapes trajectories. That is what Beijing feared. And that is precisely what never materialized. Instead, what we saw was something else entirely. Not a strengthening of alliances, but their gradual erosion. Not coordination, but fragmentation. And in that fragmentation lies the real story. Because in the 21st century, alliances are no longer just about military commitments or formal treaties. They are systems of trust. Complex networks where nations align behavior, sacrifice short-term gains, and operate collectively toward long-term stability. When that trust weakens, the structure weakens. And when that structure weakens, power does not disappear, it shifts. Quietly, gradually, but decisively. And that shift is what we are witnessing now. It took the United States 70 years to construct that architecture. Not overnight, not by accident, but through sustained, deliberate effort. 70 years of the Marshall Plan, 70 years of NATO summits, of G7 coordination, of painstaking WTO negotiations, 70 years of bilateral agreements, security guarantees, and most importantly, presence, showing up consistently, being, even if imperfectly, reliable. That is how trust is built at the scale of the international system. And then, in a remarkably short span of time, that architecture was not merely questioned, it was destabilized. Not carefully dismantled, not strategically reformed, but disrupted, abruptly. And what made this disruption particularly consequential was not just the action itself, but the manner in which it was carried out. Because when alliances are recalibrated through calculated strategy, there remains a framework, logic, incentives, room for negotiation. But when alliances are strained through grievance, through a worldview,
that reduces decades of institutional cooperation into a series of transactional imbalances, the signal that is sent is far more difficult to repair. It is not simply disagreement, it is unpredictability. And unpredictability in international relations is corrosive. Because once a nation is no longer perceived as a stable partner, every agreement becomes provisional. Every commitment becomes questionable. Every promise carries a silent asterisk. And this is the precise moment where China enters the equation, not with spectacle, not with declarations, but with timing. Carefully calibrated timing. Beijing does not arrive loudly. It does not seek to dominate the narrative. It positions itself to fulfill a vacuum. And the currency it offers in that vacuum is not ideology. It is consistency, predictability, continuity. Agreements that once signed are sustained. Now, to understand the significance of this, you have to understand the fundamental contrast in operating philosophy. Chinese statecraft is not designed for immediacy. It is not reactive. It does not prioritize visibility. It prioritizes accumulation, incremental gains, long-term positioning, structural entrenchment. While Washington generates headlines, Beijing constructs systems, infrastructure, financing networks, trade corridors, nodes, strategic nodes, embedded across regions, gradually forming a dense, interconnected web of influence. And over time, that web begins to function as an alternative architecture. Consider the Belt and Road Initiative. For years, it was dismissed in Western discourse, labeled as unsustainable, criticized as coercive, predicted to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And to be clear, it encountered real challenges. Sri Lanka, Zambia, debt sustainability concerns, imbalanced early agreements. Those critiques were not without merit, but they missed a critical variable: adaptation. Beijing adjusted. It renegotiated. In some cases, it absorbed losses, not out of charity, but out of strategic calculation to preserve long-term relationships. And that is a crucial distinction. A system that learns evolves, and an actor that evolves over time becomes significantly more formidable than one that simply avoids error. Meanwhile, the counterweight, the American presence in development finance, infrastructure investment, and engagement with the global South, did not evolve. It receded, deliberately, publicly, and at times rhetorically dismissed. Engagement was reframed as burden. Assistance was reframed as weakness. Global responsibility was reframed as exploitation. And the message that echoed beyond American borders was unmistakable. America First did not translate internationally as strategic prioritization. It translated, quite simply, as absence. And in a system that abhors vacuums, absence is never neutral. It is an invitation, an opening, and increasingly, it is one that another power has been both willing and prepared to fill. It took the United States 70 years to construct that architecture. Not overnight, not by accident, but through sustained, deliberate effort. 70 years of the Marshall Plan, 70 years of NATO summits, of G7 coordination, of painstaking WTO negotiations, 70 years of bilateral agreements, security guarantees, and most importantly, presence, showing up consistently, being, even if imperfectly, reliable. That is how trust is built at the scale of the international system. And then, in a remarkably short span of time, that architecture was not merely questioned, it was destabilized, not carefully dismantled, not strategically reformed, but disrupted, abruptly. And what made this disruption particularly consequential was not just the action itself, but the manner in which it was carried out. Because when alliances are recalibrated through calculated strategy, there remains a framework, logic, incentives, room for negotiation. But when alliances are strained through grievance, through a worldview that reduces decades of institutional cooperation into a series of transactional imbalances, the signal that is sent is far more difficult to repair. It is not simply disagreement, it is unpredictability. And unpredictability in international relations is corrosive. Because once a nation is no longer perceived as a stable partner, every agreement becomes provisional. Every commitment becomes questionable. Every promise carries a silent asterisk. And this is the precise moment where China enters the equation, not with spectacle, not with declarations, but with timing. Carefully calibrated timing. Beijing does not arrive loudly. It does not seek to dominate the narrative. It positions itself to fulfill a vacuum. And the currency it offers in that vacuum is not ideology. It is consistency, predictability, continuity. Agreements that once signed are sustained. Now, to understand the significance of this, you have to understand the fundamental contrast in operating philosophy. Chinese statecraft is not designed for immediacy. It is not reactive. It does not prioritize visibility. It prioritizes accumulation, incremental gains, long-term positioning, structural entrenchment. While Washington generates headlines, Beijing constructs systems, infrastructure, financing networks, trade corridors, nodes, strategic nodes embedded across regions, gradually forming a dense, interconnected web of influence. And over time, that web begins to function as an alternative architecture. Consider the Belt and Road Initiative. For years, it was dismissed in Western discourse, labeled as unsustainable, criticized as coercive, predicted to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And to be clear, it encountered real challenges: Sri Lanka, Zambia, debt sustainability concerns, imbalanced early agreements. Those critiques were not without merit, but they missed a critical variable: adaptation. Beijing adjusted. It renegotiated. In some cases, it absorbed losses, not out of charity, but out of strategic calculation to preserve long-term relationships. And that is a crucial distinction. A system that learns evolves, and an actor that evolves over time becomes significantly more formidable than one that simply avoids error. Meanwhile, the counterweight, the American presence in development finance, infrastructure investment, and engagement with the Global South, did not evolve. It receded, deliberately, publicly, and at times rhetorically dismissed. Engagement was reframed as burden. Assistance was reframed as weakness. Global responsibility was reframed as exploitation. And the message that echoed beyond American borders was unmistakable. America First did not translate internationally as strategic prioritization. It translated, quite simply, as absence. And in a system that abhors vacuums, absence is never neutral. It is an invitation, an opening. And increasingly, it is one that another power has been both willing and prepared to fill. Not because China is uniquely brilliant at exploiting every fracture, although at times it certainly is, but because the international system, like any system, obeys a kind of gravity. When space opens, something fills it. And what we are witnessing now is less a story of deliberate replacement and more a story of structural inevitability. But to fully understand the depth of this moment, we need to move beyond institutions and policies and look inward, into the psychological dimension. Because grand strategy is not crafted by governments alone. It is sustained, reinforced, and legitimized by populations, by the narratives people internalize about who they are and where they belong in the world. And inside China, that narrative has been undergoing a profound reactivation. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party has balanced its legitimacy on two pillars. The first is material: continued economic growth, rising living standards, tangible progress. The second is narrative: a story of national revival that is not merely about becoming powerful, but about becoming restored, correcting a historical injustice. What is often referred to as the century of humiliation, stretching from the Opium Wars to the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, is not a distant abstraction within China. It is embedded.
in textbooks, in media, in collective memory. It functions as an emotional baseline, a lens through which external pressure is interpreted. And in that context, recent American actions, tariffs, technology restrictions, blacklists, increasingly confrontational rhetoric did something strategically significant. They did not create that narrative, they activated it. Suddenly, the idea that China is being constrained, that its rise is being resisted not for what it does, but for what it represents, no longer required amplification through state messaging. It appeared to validate itself. And when a narrative begins to feel self-evident, it becomes extraordinarily powerful. The public response inside China reflected this shift. There was a measurable consolidation of sentiment, an observable alignment between state framing and popular perception. Consumer behavior adjusted, domestic brands gained symbolic weight, public discourse adopted a more assertive tone, and importantly, much of this was not purely manufactured. It carried elements of genuine reaction, of perceived affront, of collective pressure. That kind of sentiment provides political utility. It simplifies complexity. It reduces internal friction. It allows leadership to reframe external tension as internal cohesion. And historically, that dynamic has been a consistent feature of centralized systems. External pressure, when calibrated imprecisely, does not always fragment. It can consolidate. In attempting to constrain China externally, the effect, at least in part, was to stabilize it internally. But the implications extend beyond political psychology. They move into the realm of technology, where the unintended consequences become even more pronounced. The stated objective of US policy, export controls, semiconductor restrictions, entity listings, was clear: to slow China's progress in critical technologies, to preserve a technological edge, to maintain structural advantage. But outcomes in complex systems rarely align cleanly with intentions. Inside China, these measures triggered something closer to mobilization, a large-scale, state-supported acceleration of domestic capability. Investment surged, research intensified, industrial policy became more focused, more urgent. Companies that were expected to contract instead adapted, not fully, not without difficulty, but sufficiently to challenge earlier assumptions. The re-emergence of advanced domestic chip development, the persistence of firms like Huawei in high-end manufacturing, the continued expansion in sectors such as telecommunications and consumer electronics, these are not isolated events. They are indicators. Indicators of a system responding under constraint, not by retreating, but by recalibrating. And this pattern is not confined to semiconductors. It is visible in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, in battery technology, sectors where scale, coordination, and long-term investment converge. The result has been the rise of firms that are not only competitive domestically, but increasingly relevant globally. And while these trajectories were not created by external pressure, they have, in many cases, been accelerated by it. Because constraint, under certain conditions, reduces dependency. And reduced dependency alters leverage. A nation that relies less on external inputs becomes more difficult to influence through those inputs, more resistant to pressure, more autonomous in negotiation. And that brings us to what may be the most structurally significant dimension of all. Not trade, not manufacturing, but finance. The US dollar is not simply a currency. It is infrastructure. It underpins global trade, anchors reserves, and enables a system through which financial influence can be projected with extraordinary precision. Sanctions, access restrictions, disconnection from dollar clearing systems. These are not symbolic tools. They are instruments of systemic power. But like all instruments of power, their effectiveness depends on continued participation, on collective acceptance, on the daily, repeated decision by nations to operate within that system rather than outside it. And when that system is used more frequently as a tool of coercion, especially beyond narrowly defined cases, the incentives begin to shift. Gradually, cautiously,
but persistently. Alternatives begin to emerge, not as replacements, at least not immediately, but as hedges, parallel channels, bilateral arrangements, local currency settlements, experimental frameworks. None of these on their own displace the dollar, but taken together over time, they represent something more subtle, a diversification of dependence. And in a system built on centrality, even small degrees of diversification carry long-term implications. Because the power of a global system is not lost in a single moment. It is diluted incrementally, quietly, until one day it is no longer singular. And the nation most actively engaged in constructing those alternatives is China. Not in a dramatic, system-shattering way, not through sudden replacement, but through gradual accumulation. The share of global trade settled in yuan remains limited. China's cross-border payment infrastructure is still modest compared to legacy systems. But focusing on current scale misses the more important variable, trajectory. A decade ago, the yuan was largely absent from international settlement. Today, its presence, while still partial, is expanding in very specific, strategically chosen corridors. Energy trade, bilateral agreements, regional arrangements. Russia has shifted portions of its transactions. Discussions have emerged in the Gulf about alternative pricing mechanisms. Currency swap agreements have been signed across multiple regions. Expanding economic blocs are exploring parallel systems, not necessarily to replace the dollar immediately, but to reduce exclusive dependence on it. And that distinction matters, because systemic change at this level does not occur through abrupt displacement. It emerges through scaffolding, layer by layer, agreement by agreement, exception by exception, until what was once unthinkable becomes at the very least possible. And each time financial power is exercised in a way that introduces uncertainty, each time sanctions appear less like a last resort and more like a routine instrument, that scaffolding gains another layer. Not out of defiance, but out of precaution. Because trust, particularly in monetary systems, cannot be compelled. It must be chosen. And it must be continuously reaffirmed. When pressure replaces reassurance, the rational response for other actors is not confrontation. It is diversification. And in observing this dynamic, China does not rush. It studies, it records, it adjusts. Now, if we shift our focus to the global south, the pattern becomes even clearer, because this is where long-term positioning is most visible. There is a concept in Chinese strategic thought, Tao Guang Yang Hui, often translated as hide your strength, bide your time. It reflects a discipline of restraint, of delayed visibility, of prioritizing accumulation over assertion. While contemporary Chinese policy under Xi Jinping has become more outwardly confident, the underlying logic of that concept has not disappeared. It has evolved. And nowhere is that evolution more evident than in China's engagement with developing regions over the past 2 decades. Where others debated, China built. Where others assessed risk, China accepted it, selectively, strategically. Roads, ports, railways, power infrastructure, visible systems, tangible outputs. Now, it is important to acknowledge that not all these projects were optimal. Some were financially burdensome. Some were negotiated on terms that favored Beijing. But infrastructure has a unique characteristic. It is concrete. It can be seen, used, measured. It alters daily life in ways that are immediate and perceptible. And in international relations, perception often carries as much weight as principle. When representatives arrive in a capital city and can point to physical transformation, transport corridors, energy grids, public facilities, the impact is direct. Comparisons become intuitive, not theoretical. And when in parallel, Alternative partners reduce their visible presence, scale back development initiatives, withdraw programs, reframe engagement as expendable. The signal that is received is not subtle. It is interpreted as reprioritization, or more simply, as distance. And states respond accordingly, not necessarily by abandoning existing relationships, but by recalibrating them, by hedging, by ensuring that reliance is distributed rather than concentrated. Because in an environment of uncertainty, diversification becomes a strategy of stability. And then we arrive at a dimension that is often dismissed but remains deeply consequential: moral authority. It is an unfashionable term in some analytical circles, often set aside in favor of more quantifiable metrics of power. But its effects are tangible. The ability of a system to attract, to be seen as legitimate, aspirational, worthy of alignment, is not secondary to power. It is a form of power. Historically, the United States derived significant influence not only from its economic and military capacity, but from the perception of its institutional model. The idea, however imperfectly realized, of accountable governance, rule of law, open discourse. These were not universally adopted, but they were widely regarded as benchmarks. And that perception created alignment, not coerced, but voluntary. When that perception weakens, when internal contradictions become more visible, when institutional stability appears less certain, the external effect is not immediate collapse, it is gradual erosion. Doubt enters the equation, and where doubt grows, alternatives gain space. China does not attempt to replicate the same model. It offers something different, not participatory politics, but continuity, not ideological universality, but functional stability, a system that prioritizes order, predictability, and long-term planning. And for many states, particularly those navigating development challenges, that proposition carries its own appeal, not necessarily as an ideal, but as an option. And in a world where options are expanding, influence is no longer defined by dominance alone. It is defined by availability, by credibility, by the ability to remain a constant in an increasingly uncertain system. And that is where the balance is quietly shifting. Not individual rights, but collective prosperity. Not electoral competition, but administrative competence. Now, let me be precise here, because precision matters. This is not an argument that one system is inherently superior to the other. It is not a defense of authoritarianism, nor a dismissal of democratic values. It is an observation about perception. Because in international politics, perception often precedes reality. When one model appears unstable, internally divided, visibly strained, and another presents itself as orderly, consistent, and effective, the comparative appeal begins to shift. Not universally, not permanently, but perceptibly. And that perception in itself is a form of power. Nowhere is this dynamic more sensitive, more consequential than in Taiwan. For decades, stability in the Taiwan Strait has rested not solely on military balance, but on credibility, on a shared understanding, held in Taipei, in Beijing, and across the region, that the United States would act if deterrence failed. Not necessarily because action was guaranteed, but because the possibility of action was believable, and that belief was sufficient. Deterrence at its core is psychological. It is constructed from consistency, from signaling, from a history of commitments that have been honored. When that consistency begins to erode, when alliance commitments are framed transactionally, when security guarantees are discussed in conditional terms, when rhetoric becomes unpredictable, the structure of deterrence is affected. Not visibly, not immediately, but incrementally. Doubt enters. And in a high-stakes environment like the Taiwan Strait, even marginal doubt alters strategic calculations. It does not require a shift in military capability, only a shift in perceived intent. If at any point Beijing begins to assess that intervention is uncertain, that hesitation is plausible, that negotiation might replace response, then the threshold for action changes. I am not suggesting inevitability. I am pointing to risk.
Because deterrence does not fail all at once. It degrades quietly until one day a miscalculation becomes possible. And in that sense, the erosion of credibility is not abstract. It is consequential. Now, let us move beyond diagnosis, because analysis without direction is incomplete. What should be understood from all of this? First, none of this is irreversible. The structural advantages of the United States remain substantial. Its research institutions, its capital markets, its innovation ecosystems, its demographic profile relative to other advanced economies. These are not easily replicated. They provide resilience. And with strategic recalibration, with renewed engagement, with consistent policy over time, credibility can be rebuilt. But, and this is critical, rebuilding is always more difficult than maintaining, because trust, once weakened, returns slowly. The second point is equally important. China's trajectory, while significant, is not without constraint. It faces deep structural challenges, economic imbalances, demographic pressures, internal policy tensions. Its system, for all its capacity for long-term planning, also lacks certain mechanisms for correction. This is not a story of inevitable dominance. It is a story of competition under conditions of uncertainty. And in such a competition, outcomes are rarely determined by one side's strength alone. They are shaped by relative performance, by comparative coherence, by which system proves more stable, more adaptive, more credible over time. And at this moment, one of the competitors is expending considerable energy not on strengthening its position, but on complicating it. That is the central tension. This is not fundamentally a story about Chinese strategy. It is a story about American self-disruption. And perhaps the most striking aspect of it, the almost paradoxical element, is that these actions are undertaken with the conviction that they serve renewal, that they restore strength, that they correct imbalance. Yet in practice, they often produce the opposite effect. Supply chains that took decades to construct cannot be rapidly reconfigured. Allies confronted do not consolidate, they recalibrate. Institutions abandoned do not disappear, they evolve, often without the absent participant. And influence, once seated, is rarely recovered without cost. Which brings us to the final point. Power in the 21st century is not defined primarily by force, nor even by economic scale alone. It is relational. It resides in networks, in trust accumulated over time, in the expectation that commitments will be honored, that partnerships are stable, that participation in a system carries more benefits than risks. For decades, the United States cultivated the most extensive relational network in modern history, a system of alliances, institutions, and shared frameworks that, despite imperfections, was broadly accepted, in many cases, genuinely valued. That network did not emerge spontaneously. It was built, maintained, reinforced, and like all complex systems, it can also be weakened. Not necessarily through external attack, but through internal neglect, through inconsistency, through the gradual erosion of the very trust that sustains it. And when that happens, the consequences are not always immediate, but they are almost always cumulative. And once they reach a certain threshold, they become very difficult to reverse. That network is the real source of American power. And today, it is being weakened not by Chinese aggression, but by American choices, by confusing strength with isolation and intimidation with respect, by sacrificing long-term alliances for short-term political wins. While America pulls back, China moves forward, slowly, imperfectly, but steadily expanding its influence. So who is making China stronger? Not Xi Jinping alone. It is also America's retreat. When the world's leading power abandons leadership, its rivals step in. Future historians may see this era as the moment the global balance began to shift. The tragedy is not that China is rising.
Rising powers are normal in history. The tragedy is that America had every advantage to compete, lead, and shape the future, but chose not to use it. Instead of playing a winning hand, it folded while believing it was winning. And that is how Trump may be helping make China great again without realizing what is being lost. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay critical, and stay informed, because the world is changing and many are not paying attention.